In December 2015, two articles dropped within hours of each other, one from Wired, another from Gizmodo. Both suggested the same startling possibility, that an Australian computer scientist named Dr. Craig Wright might be the mysterious creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto. Within minutes, the crypto world lit up. If true, it would have been one of the great reveals in modern tech history. If false, it would expose one of the most audacious fabrications in the industry. Wright's name spread through crypto forums and developer chats like wildfire. Investigators scrambled to verify old emails, blog posts, and digital signatures linking him to Bitcoin's earliest years. Within hours, Australian Federal Police raided his Sydney home and offices on tax grounds, officially unrelated but suspiciously timed. By nightfall, the once obscure security consultant had become the most polarizing man in crypto, a self-declared visionary to a few, an opportunist with a motive to many. That motive, as court records and regulatory files later revealed, was financial. Before any global headlines, Wright's companies were under audit by the Australian Taxation Office for claiming millions in disputed R&D credits tied to supposed Bitcoin research. Those investigations predated his emergence as Satoshi by months. When his tax claims came under pressure, Wright's story shifted. Suddenly, he wasn't just researching Bitcoin, he was Bitcoin. The genius who invented the protocol would, of course, have legitimate grounds for such credits. The claim, if believed, could transform mounting liability into a scientific triumph. Over the following years, Wright built an entire identity around that story, presenting himself as a wronged inventor fighting bureaucrats and doubters. He produced evidence, withdrew it, sued critics, and created companies dedicated to what he called Satoshi's vision. The further authorities and experts questioned his proof, the further he doubled down. Through it all, the central question remained unchanged. Was this the mind that built Bitcoin, or a man using its legend to rescue his finances and reputation? To unravel it, we have to start before the headlines. In the years when Craig Wright's ambition, intellect and debt collided inside Australia's tax system. Craig Stephen Wright was born in Brisbane, Australia in October 1970. He grew up in a middle-class family and showed an early fascination with computers. Former classmates described him as intelligent but abrasive, the kind of student who argued passionately about technical principles and wanted to prove he knew more than everyone else. That drive for recognition would later shape much of his professional life. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Wright studied computer science and engineering at several universities, including Charles Sturt University and the University of Queensland. His educational record would become a recurring point of contention. Wright often cited multiple postgraduate degrees and doctorates, while journalists later found some of those claims difficult to verify. He pursued numerous certifications in networking, security, and digital forensics, gradually building a profile as a technical consultant for academic and corporate clients. By the early 2000s, Wright was working in IT security and systems administration roles. He became involved with the cybersecurity firm Aussiemail, one of Australia's earliest internet service providers, and later established his own companies focusing on digital forensics and enterprise security. Around this time, he also began consulting for government agencies and major corporations, offering expertise in detecting cybercrime and developing risk management frameworks. On paper, Wright's resume painted him as a legitimate expert in the theoretical underpinnings of cryptography and data systems. His technical writings from this period provide an interesting window into his mindset. In blog archives and academic submissions, Wright discussed topics like distributed architectures, privacy technologies, and digital currencies, themes that predated Bitcoin's 2008 whitepaper. Some posts from as early as 2007 referenced an idea called BitCash, which he described as a peer-to-peer payment system not reliant on banks. These fragments became central evidence years later when investigators scoured his old writings for proof of early Bitcoin involvement. Still, Wright's professional reputation in Australia remained mixed. Colleagues acknowledged his technical competence, but often questioned the credibility of his self-promotion. His business ventures were ambitious, but not always sustainable. In 2007, he founded a company called De Morgan Limited, through which he planned to build a bank for the unbanked using digital currency. The idea never fully materialized, but apparently it hinted at Wright's long-standing obsession with reshaping global finance. He also became involved with the Sydney-based data center project, Cloudcroft, which aimed to provide hosting for supercomputing and cryptocurrency research. Wright reportedly poured massive sums into the venture, claiming government grants and R&D tax offsets. Years later, Australian tax officials would scrutinise many of those deductions, leading to investigations into his filings. The timing would later overlap with the early Bitcoin years, another connection conspiracy theorists would dissect. One crucial thread connecting Wright's pre-Bitcoin career was his interest in security auditing and forensic traceability. He often argued online that privacy in digital cash didn't mean anonymity. It meant controlled transparency, where transactions could be audited when necessary. That philosophy contrasts sharply with the libertarian ethos held by early Bitcoin adopters, many of whom valued complete anonymity from government oversight. It's an irony that would define how the Bitcoin community reacted when Wright eventually claimed to be its creator. By 2008, Wright had assembled a network of contacts that included cryptographers, academics, and technology entrepreneurs in Australia and abroad. He frequently talked about building new systems of trust that didn't rely on central authorities, the very principles that Bitcoin embodied. Whether these were independent ideas or reflections of his later self-image, as Satoshi, remains fiercely debated. For now, what's clear is that Craig Wright entered the Bitcoin era not as an outsider stumbling onto the scene, but as someone deeply immersed in cryptography, finance technology, and bold claims about his own intellect. He wasn't yet Satoshi Nakamoto in the eyes of the world, but he already carried the blend of technical knowledge, ambition, and ego that would later make that claim plausible to some and infuriating to others. On the morning of December 8, 2015, reporters at Wired were finalizing a story that had been brewing for months. Their investigation pointed to a man almost no one in the crypto world had ever heard of. Dr. Craig Stephen Wright, a 45-year-old computer scientist living in Sydney. The headlines suggested an extraordinary possibility. They might have found Satoshi Nakamoto. Within hours, Gizmodo published a parallel piece citing leaked documents and emails, allegedly linking Wright to Bitcoin's earliest days. The coincidence was no accident. Both outlets had received overlapping caches of materials from an anonymous source who claimed to have worked with Wright. By nightfall, every major tech publication was chasing the lead. The materials seemed, at first glance, convincing. There were archived blog posts dated back to 2008 and 2009 in which Wright appeared to discuss launching a new digital currency. An email, purportedly from his associate Dave Kleiman, contained early Bitcoin terminology. There were also fragments of PGP keys, digital identifiers once controlled by Satoshi, and references to transactions between Wright's and Kleiman's accounts that supposedly matched early Bitcoin activity. One document even contained a draft of the Bitcoin whitepaper, attached to a file labeled Bitcoin Draft. For journalists, it looked like the smoking gun that could finally unmask one of tech's greatest mysteries. But within hours of the stories going live, things began to unravel. Members of the Bitcoin developer community examined the evidence and noticed inconsistencies. Some timestamps didn't align with known historical records. Certain blog posts appeared to have been modified years after their stated publication dates. In one, Wright claimed to have been working on Bitcoin the day the white paper was released, yet metadata suggested the post had been edited in 2013. Experienced cryptographers pointed out that the supposed PGP signatures didn't actually verify against Satoshi's known public keys. The more they looked, the more the puzzle pieces refused to fit together neatly. Meanwhile, in Australia, Wright's life turned chaotic. Within hours of the story's release, Australian Federal Police raided his Sydney home and office, not over Bitcoin, but over taxes. His company, De Morgan Limited, had claimed millions in government R&D grants for research into supercomputing and digital currency projects. Investigators suspected the work didn't exist. Central to those claims was the story that he had developed Bitcoin's foundational technology before its release. Reporters later uncovered internal ATO notes showing officials had already questioned that assertion months prior. The timing of the raid made sense. The Satoshi narrative was serving as both shield and sales pitch for a collapsing tax strategy. Wright disappeared from public view, leaving journalists and Bitcoiners with more questions than answers. As the crypto community dissected each line of the Wired and Gizmodo articles, the tone shifted from curiosity to skepticism. Prominent developers like Gavin Andresen, who had corresponded with Satoshi in Bitcoin's early days, urged caution. Andresen privately reviewed parts of the material, but emphasized that only a verifiable cryptographic signature from Satoshi's known keys could settle the matter. Others were harsher. On forums like Reddit and Bitcoin Talk, users accused Wired of falling for an elaborate hoax. One user called it the most sophisticated self-dox in crypto history, suggesting Wright himself might have planted the evidence to gain fame or investment attention. The deeper journalists dug, the messier it got. Some of the leaked documents referenced dealings with Australian tax authorities over R&D credits claimed by Wright's company, De Morgan. There were inconsistencies in claims about his doctoral degrees. One university hinted that a PhD listed on his LinkedIn profile had never been awarded. Even small details, like Wright's self-described achievements in supercomputing, showed discrepancies when compared to official records. Each revelation chipped away at credibility, but the intrigue only grew stronger. Wired faced a wave of criticism. Originally, their article's headline hinted Wright could be either a brilliant hoaxer or the creator of Bitcoin. After the discrepancies emerged, they quietly revised it to emphasize the doubt. Gizmodo likewise published a follow-up, admitting several of their documents might have been forged. But by then, the story had escaped their control. Every major outlet, from The Guardian to The Economist, was chasing Wright. The man himself went silent for months, turning his disappearance into part of the myth. Behind the scenes, the leak trail was complex. The anonymous source who handed over the material claimed to be an insider or former partner seeking exposure. Some later theorized the cache was compiled using internal company data, perhaps triggered by a dispute among Wright's associates. Others guessed it was Wright himself, orchestrating a partial reveal to preempt forthcoming government investigations or to legitimize his tax positions by claiming Bitcoin holdings worth hundreds of millions. None of these motives were proven, but speculation filled the information vacuum. In retrospect, the 2015 outing worked like a match tossed into dry grass. It reignited the global hunt for Satoshi and attached a living face to the enigma. But unlike previous guesses, from Nick Szabo to Hal Finney, who we have looked at previously on this channel, this candidate leaned into the allegation rather than running from it. By mid-2016, Wright would reappear publicly, flanked by high-profile supporters, and claim to provide cryptographic proof that he was indeed Satoshi Nakamoto. Yet within days, those demonstrations would collapse under scrutiny, deepening the divide between his believers and detractors. For now, December 2015 marked the turning point. Craig Wright had entered the story of Bitcoin not as a coder or investor, but as a mystery headline bursting into real life. Whether he planned the exposure or was blindsided by it would remain disputed. What became certain is that the outing transformed his private ambitions into a global spectacle, one that would dominate his career, his finances, and his reputation for years to come. In April 2016, after 4 months of silence, Craig Wright re-emerged. This time, he wasn't just the subject of speculation. He was taking control of the narrative. Major media outlets, including the BBC, The Economist, and GQ, were summoned to London under strict embargo. Wright promised to show the world definitive proof that he was Satoshi Nakamoto. After years of guessing and rumor, this was the moment the Bitcoin origin mystery might finally end. The BBC filmed Wright in a dimly lit room as he sat at a laptop. He claimed to sign a message using one of Satoshi's private keys, the cryptographic identifiers only the real Bitcoin creator could control. The signature, he said, would verify publicly that he was the person behind the pseudonym. Accompanying the event were blog posts on his website explaining how the proof worked, referencing Bitcoin's early code and his own recollections of writing it. To the mainstream press, it looked convincing. The BBC report stated he had digitally signed messages using cryptographic keys created during the early days of Bitcoin. They quoted Gavin Anderson, one of the first Bitcoin developers, who confirmed that he had personally witnessed Wright perform the demonstration and was convinced by it. For a brief moment, it seemed like the mystery was solved. Within hours, though, technical experts across the Bitcoin community began unpacking the details, and cracks appeared almost immediately. Analysts downloaded the so-called proof Wright had placed on his blog and discovered it wasn't a fresh cryptographic signature at all. The code referenced an old publicly available transaction from 2009 that anyone could have copied. It didn't demonstrate possession of Satoshi's private keys. Instead, it seemed like Wright had repackaged existing data and presented it as verification. Developers described the proof as meaningless. One called it a shell game dressed up as mathematics. the supposed smoking gun fizzled into thin air. The backlash was swift. On Reddit and Bitcoin Talk, users dissected every technical inconsistency line by line. Security researchers posted independent verifications showing that the digital signature was, in cryptographic terms, irrelevant. Wired ran a follow-up piece titled, "Craig Wright's Satoshi Proof is Useless." The Economist cautiously withheld judgment, noting that Wright may yet provide better evidence. Meanwhile, public opinion flipped almost overnight. Within 24 hours, the man who had supposedly ended a 7-year mystery was facing one of the most intense credibility meltdowns in tech history. Caught between skepticism and disbelief, Wright's responses shifted tone. In interviews, he grew defensive, suggesting critics would never accept any evidence he produced. He promised to perform a second conclusive demonstration using coins from one of Satoshi's earliest mind blocks, the same coins that had never moved since 2009. Moving those coins would have been absolute proof of identity. He scheduled the event, hinted that trusted intermediaries like John Matonis or Gavin Andresen would verify it privately, and told reporters that final extraordinary proof was coming. Then, suddenly, he cancelled. On May 5th, 2016, Wright posted a message on his website titled, "I'm sorry." In it, he declared that he no longer had the courage to continue the proof process, and that he would disappear from public life. The post read like a mixture of exhaustion and self-pity, part apology, part defiance. He deleted previous proof files, took down blog posts, and pulled back from media appearances. To outsiders, it looked like a full retreat. The long-awaited verification evaporated into another unsolved layer of the Bitcoin legend. The fallout was brutal. Gavin Andresen, who had initially supported Wright's claim, faced a backlash of his own. The Bitcoin Foundation revoked his commit access to the project's core code, a preemptive move to ensure security in case of compromise. Andresen maintained that the demonstration he saw in person had seemed authentic at the time, but admitted he could no longer stand by his endorsement without solid public proof. Wright's reputation in the Bitcoin community collapsed even further after that. Developers labeled him an imposter, journalists accused him of orchestrating a calculated publicity stunt, and former allies distanced themselves. Still, a small group of supporters clung to the belief that Wright really was Satoshi, arguing that he'd been driven away by the hostility of a skeptical community. Wright himself nurtured that narrative. He began emphasizing how he didn't want fame or adulation, that proving his identity wasn't for appearances but for technical and legal clarity. He claimed people had misunderstood his motives. Yet his next moves suggested otherwise. By late 2016, Wright resurfaced alongside billionaire gambling tycoon Calvin Ayre and launched nChain, a London-based blockchain firm built on hundreds of self-filed patents. Many recycled ideas already described in the Bitcoin whitepaper. It marked a shift from proving identity through code to proving it through ownership. To critics, it looked like a commercial repackaging of the "I am Satoshi" claim, this time designed to generate licensing fees and corporate legitimacy. To Wright's small circle, it was proof he wanted recognition for ideas others had supposedly stolen. But for most of the crypto world, the failure of the 2016 proof had settled the issue. Whatever his technical knowledge or ego, Craig Wright simply was not Satoshi Nakamoto. The core reason was simple. Satoshi's cryptographic keys were like fingerprints. They couldn't be faked, and only their true holder could generate valid signatures. The supposed proof from Wright used public data already visible on the blockchain. At no point did he move or sign a transaction using an early Satoshi mined coin. The absence of that act, the simplest verification possible, spoke louder than any blog post or press release. In hindsight, the 2016 events marked a turning point in how Wright approached his identity claim. Before the failed proofs, his argument rested on documentation, and afterward it shifted toward authority, law, and proprietary ownership. Having lost credibility in the technical community, he began building legitimacy through the courtroom instead of code. Over the following years, he would file lawsuits asserting that he was the author of the Bitcoin whitepaper, the rightful owner of blockchain copyrights, and the creator of Bitcoin itself. It was a transformation from alleged inventor to litigious claimant, a new phase that kept his name in headlines long after most people stopped entertaining his proofs. For the broader crypto world, the 2016 verification attempt became a cautionary tale about evidence, trust, and showmanship. In a space built on verifiable computation, Wright had offered narratives instead of math, and stories instead of signatures. The technical reality didn't bend to publicity. Every claim could be checked, none passed the test. That gap between rhetoric and cryptographic truth became the defining pattern of his career, one that would continue to echo through each subsequent lawsuit and confrontation. By the end of that year, Wright stood as both infamous and oddly empowered. He had failed the ultimate proof, yet leveraged the publicity into business ventures and alliances that extended his reach into blockchain's legal and corporate corridors. The world hadn't accepted him as Satoshi, but it hadn't forgotten him either. His failed verification became his brand, a paradox he would exploit for years to come. By 2017, Craig Wright had turned the spotlight into a weapon. He no longer tried to convince the crypto community through proofs or code. Instead, he started using corporate structures, patent filings, and courtrooms. His partnership with Calvin Ayre provided deep pockets, legal muscle, and public platforms. Together, they cultivated a media and business ecosystem designed to legitimize Wright's identity, not through consensus, but through ownership claims and institutional recognition. It started with N-Chain. The London-based company listed hundreds of blockchain-related patents, some bearing Wright's name as the inventor. Many describe mechanisms already known in Bitcoin, like digital signature systems or decentralized records. Legal experts debated whether they'd ever stand up to scrutiny, but the sheer volume sent a signal. Wright wasn't backing down. He was building an empire around Bitcoin's original vision. Publicly, he began insisting that Bitcoin had been corrupted, that the version maintained by open-source developers no longer represented Satoshi's intent. He framed himself as defending what Bitcoin was meant to be. This ideological divide crystallized during the scaling wars of 2017. The argument centered on a technical issue that had split the community for years: block size. Should Bitcoin's blocks remain capped at 1 megabyte, preserving decentralization but limiting transaction throughput? Or should the limit be raised to allow faster, cheaper transactions? Wright and Ayre championed the latter, arguing that small blocks strangled Bitcoin's potential as a global cash system. On the other side stood the Bitcoin Core developers, who prioritize stability and security. When a faction split to create Bitcoin Cash, BCH, in August 2017, Wright aligned with it enthusiastically. To him, BCH captured Satoshi's real design: peer-to-peer electronic cash, unburdened by what he called blockstream politics. Within months, though, even that alliance fractured. Wright clashed with other Bitcoin Cash leaders, including Roger Ver and developer Amaury Séchet, over further scaling and governance. The disagreements weren't merely technical, they were about philosophy, power, and ego. Wright publicly accused Ver of betraying Satoshi's vision and declared that he, Craig Wright, was the only one who truly understood the original protocol. By late 2018, those tensions boiled over into open conflict. A new fork of Bitcoin Cash emerged, championed by Wright and Ayer. They named it Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, Bitcoin SV. Its stated purpose was to restore Bitcoin to its 2009 rule set, with vastly larger block sizes and minimal developer intervention. In practice, it was a rival cryptocurrency bound to Wright's identity. He pitched it as Satoshi's Bitcoin, frequently declaring that Bitcoin SV was the real Bitcoin, and that BTC and BCH were illegal transformations. Exchanges, developers and miners were forced to choose sides. The split turned ugly. On Twitter and at conferences, Wright labeled his critics frauds and criminals. He claimed Bitcoin SV would meet global enterprise standards and eventually replace all other versions. Exchanges like Binance and Kraken delisted the coin after escalating threats between communities. When Binance CEO Changpeng Zhao tweeted that Wright was not Satoshi and called him a fraud, Wright's response wasn't to refute him technically, it was to sue. That moment marked the birth of his legal campaign. Between 2019 and 2024, Wright filed dozens of lawsuits across multiple jurisdictions, targeting journalists, developers, and rival entrepreneurs for defamation and intellectual property infringement. He argued that any public claim that he wasn't Satoshi damaged his reputation and his company's. Many defendants saw the cases as strategic intimidation, chilling effects meant to silence criticism. But each lawsuit, success or failure, reinforced Wright's image as relentless and unyielding. One of the earliest and most consequential cases emerged in Florida. The estate of Dave Kleiman, Wright's former associate, sued him for billions in Bitcoin, alleging that Wright had defrauded Kleiman's family out of jointly mined coins and intellectual property. The suit introduced thousands of pages of emails, company records, and messages that painted a complicated picture of Wright's early activities. The court scrutinized his documentation closely. Many papers contained digital signatures and timestamps later shown to be inconsistent or modified. At one point, a forensic expert testified that documents purportedly from 2011 contained fonts not released until years later. That detail became emblematic of the broader problem around Wright's evidence. Throughout the trial, Wright maintained emotional testimony, at times breaking down on the stand. He accused adversaries of trying to destroy his legacy and insisted he'd transferred many of the early coins to trust structures for security reasons. The jury ultimately ruled that Wright had not been a partner in inventing Bitcoin with Kleiman, but did find him liable for a smaller sum related to business dealings under W&K Info Defense Research. For the public, the verdict didn't deliver clarity. It underscored the ambiguity that followed him everywhere. Those seeking a definitive creator or conman answer found neither. Parallel to the Kleiman case, Wright waged an aggressive copyright campaign in England, claiming ownership of the Bitcoin whitepaper and core database design. He argued that as Satoshi, he held literary and database rights to the material and that operating websites hosting the white paper without authorization constituted infringement. Several developers and the non-profit Bitcoin Association were drawn into the dispute. Critics dismissed it as an attempt to rebrand his identity claim as an IP monopoly. Still, the strategy had consequences. Legal costs for small developers mounted, and the precedent, if any ruling favored him, could influence how open-source projects handled documentation rights. His legal barrage extended to public figures. He sued podcaster Peter McCormack for calling him a fraud, blogger Hodlonaut for mocking his claims on Twitter, and exchange operators who refused to list Bitcoin SV. Some cases concluded with symbolic damages or judicial criticism of Wright's inconsistent testimony. In the McCormack case, the judge ruled that Wright presented false evidence and reduced any damages to a token £1, describing his credibility as unimpressive. Yet Wright treated partial victories and procedural successes as vindication, proclaiming each as legal confirmation of his identity. Behind the spectacle, N-Chain continued its operations. The company collaborated with enterprises on private blockchain applications and maintained the patent pipeline. Wright presented at conferences positioning Bitcoin SV as the enterprise blockchain for governments and corporations. Support from Calvin Ayre's CoinGeek media network ensured constant coverage. Events showcased Wright discussing the law of Bitcoin, asserting that legal enforcement, not anonymity, was the future of digital currency. His vision reframed Bitcoin from a libertarian experiment into a tool for regulated commerce. It appealed to businesses but alienated almost everyone in the decentralized first community. The irony was that by institutionalizing his crusade, Wright hardened opposition even further. Prominent Bitcoin developers rallied around open-source permissions and published joint defenses against his copyright claims. Academics dissected his court filings, identifying altered timestamps, inconsistent claims about cryptographic key management, and shifting narratives. Each inconsistency eroded public confidence, yet the lawsuits kept coming. For Ayre and Wright, even adversarial press coverage reinforced name recognition and positioned them as central players in the fight over Bitcoin's future. By 2023, Wright's identity claim was entangled with dozens of lawsuits, defamation actions against podcasters like Peter McCormack and Twitter users such as Hodlonaut, copyright disputes over the Bitcoin white paper, and the heavyweight clash with the Crypto Open Patent Alliance, or Copa. None of those proceedings brought him closer to technical validation. When British courts ordered him to either move or sign from early Satoshi addresses, he could not. Judges repeatedly noted the gap between narrative and proof, while Wright's filings leaned on storylines about offshore trusts, missing keys, and allegedly lost hardware. Legal experts called his tactics lawfare by exhaustion, less about truth than about silence in dissent. Still, he treated each procedural reprieve as confirmation, telling supporters that the courts have recognized Satoshi, even as rulings said the opposite. That same year, new court records revealed internal communications contradicting his earlier statements about document creation and partnerships. In community discussions, few doubted anymore that Wright's narrative contained major fabrications. Yet his ability to sustain the fight, fund legal strategies, and command headlines demonstrated remarkable endurance. For Calvin Ayre's media outlets, the ongoing battles offered a constant stream of content affirming the existence of a lawful Bitcoin resting on Bitcoin SV. The saga reached another critical juncture when the Copa Crypto Open Patent Alliance, filed a case seeking a declaratory judgment that Craig Wright was not Satoshi Nakamoto. The proceedings drew together years of testimony, file analyses, and cryptographic evidence. For the first time, the question wasn't whether he could prove he was Satoshi, but whether a court could formally declare that he wasn't. The filings detailed alleged fabrications of key documents, including manipulated metadata and forged signatures. Whether or not the court would make a definitive statement, the overwhelming tone signaled skepticism. At the heart of all this remained Wright's unaltered conviction. Interviews and court transcripts revealed a man utterly certain of his role in history, dismissing technical counter-arguments as distractions. He told reporters that Bitcoin SV would outlast criticism just as early skeptics doubted Bitcoin itself. To supporters, he was a misunderstood genius backed by a vision of lawful digital commerce. To detractors, he was a litigant who'd replace code with legal threats. And in that contrast, empirical verification versus narrative assertion, the larger cultural battle of crypto played out. By the end of the decade, Craig Wright's campaign had achieved something paradoxical. It made his identity less plausible, but his presence permanent. Each legal defeat reinforced public disbelief, but kept his name attached to Bitcoin's mythology. Bitcoin SV, the offshoot he called Satoshi's vision, survived mostly on insider funding and loyalty, not user adoption. Technical leaders like Andreas Antonopoulos and Adam Back publicly called his proofs provably false, while developer Luke Dashja summarized the community's consensus. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary math. For them, the case was closed. Cryptography had spoken. Yet Wright's lawsuits and bravado ensured that even in refutation, his myth endured. By the time the lawsuits began multiplying, Craig Wright's story had shifted from a tech mystery to a drawn-out legal saga. The public demonstrations were over. What came next took place in witness boxes, among forensic experts, binders of emails, and the slow grind of discovery. Courtrooms across Florida and London, places far from online debates, became the new battleground over the question that had haunted Bitcoin for more than a decade. Could he actually prove he was Satoshi Nakamoto? The Florida trial between the Kleeman estate and Craig Wright became the centerpiece. Filed in 2018 and reaching a jury in late 2021, the case forced years of speculation into legal form. The estate of computer forensics expert Dave Kleiman claimed that Wright and Kleiman had jointly created Bitcoin and mined over 1 million coins together, worth tens of billions. Wright denied any partnership, insisting Kleiman was an advisor and friend, not a co-inventor. For both sides, the stakes were astronomical. Control of early Bitcoin wealth, and, by implication, the right to claim authorship of the whitepaper itself. Over several weeks, the Miami courtroom became a theater of contradictions. Jurors saw untold gigabytes of documents, many produced by Wright himself as evidence of early work. But page after page revealed inconsistencies. Text files with altered timestamps, letters referring to companies that didn't yet exist, and PDFs carrying fonts released long after their supposed creation dates. Forensic analysts testified that numerous documents appeared manipulated. Wright countered that software migrations and time zone differences explained the discrepancies. At times, he broke down in tears, telling the court that he was being crucified for inventing something good. Each outburst kept spectators transfixed. One recurring feature of the trial was the so-called tulip trust. Wright described it as a complex web of trusts holding Satoshi's early coins, supposedly governed by encrypted keys distributed to intermediaries years earlier. But when pressed to produce those keys, he couldn't. Instead, he offered lists of addresses said to correspond to the early Bitcoin cache. Independent analysts quickly pointed out that many of those addresses never appeared in early mined blocks or contained coins known to belong to others. The court grew skeptical. At one point, Judge Beth Bloom admonished him for failing to comply with discovery orders, noting that his explanations defied common sense. When the jury finally delivered its verdict, it walked a narrow line. They found Wright not liable for most claims of partnership or theft, largely because the estate couldn't prove the alleged joint mining agreements, but they did award $100 million in damages to W&K Info Defense, a company tied to both men's early cybersecurity work. Wright immediately declared victory. To him, the absence of a ruling proclaiming a partnership equated to recognition that he alone had created Bitcoin. To observers, it looked like a partial defeat disguised as triumph. The jurors, bound by civil law standards, had sidestepped the most sensational question. Was he Satoshi? That remained unanswered. Even before the Kleeman verdict, Wright's attention had moved to a broader arena. In 2021, a consortium of technology companies calling themselves the Crypto Open Patent Alliance, Copa, led by Jack Dorsey's Block, Coinbase and others, filed a lawsuit in the UK seeking a declaratory judgment that Wright was not the author of the Bitcoin white paper. It was an inversion of his own campaigns. Rather than him suing detractors, the industry sued him, aiming to close the question legally once and for all. Their argument was simple. Wright's evidence of authorship relied on forged documents and inconsistent statements. They wanted a judicial declaration to prevent further threats to developers and open-source projects. Discovery in the Copa case drew from years of prior litigation. Forensic specialists examined Wright's hard drives and file metadata, uncovering irregular patterns. Documents allegedly written in 2008 contain metadata from Windows 8, released years later. A text editor's auto-save traces suggested edits had been made shortly before submission. Emails he produced as early communications with Satoshi references included PGP fingerprint identifiers that didn't exist at the claimed dates. Copa's lawyers presented these details as a systematic pattern of fabrication. Wright maintained that file corruption and data migrations during hardware upgrades explained every anomaly. But within technical circles, patience was wearing thin. His explanations often created new contradictions instead of resolving old ones. The hearings also revived the issue of the missing cryptographic signatures. The simplest method of proof, signing a message using one of Satoshi's known private keys, remained unperformed. Judges in multiple jurisdictions gently acknowledged the absence. In one hearing, when asked if he could demonstrate present ownership of any early keys, Wright replied that the keys were held by trust structures, unreachable without multi-party authorization. Copa's counsel pointed out that no corroborating witness had ever confirmed such a trust existed independently. The exchange reinforced how the claim remained anchored to narrative, not mathematics. Outside the courtroom, the case became a rallying cry for open-source developers. Copa framed it as a defense of their ability to publish and maintain Bitcoin's code without harassment. Each time Wright sent legal threats to volunteers maintaining a node client or hosting the white paper, support for the alliance grew. donations poured in from across the industry. The spectacle drew mainstream coverage. Newspapers described it as the trial over Bitcoin's soul. The paradox was that Wright's campaign, intended to cement identity, kept amplifying its doubt in the court of public opinion. During pre-trial disclosures, several of Wright's former associates submitted statements describing work for N-Chain and interactions over document preparation. Some indicated they had seen edits made to backdated files, later cited as early Bitcoin plans. Others noted inconsistencies in those stories from meeting to meeting. The testimony painted a portrait of a man passionately constructing a narrative that required continual maintenance. Each assertion demanded new documentation, and each document required new explanations. Lawyers compared it to building a castle on sand, intricate but unstable. Yet if Wright's reputation suffered, his determination didn't. He continued publishing essays asserting that Bitcoin's design had always envisioned a lawful, auditable ledger. He told interviewers that courts, not code, would ultimately define truth. "The law is proof," he said in one recorded deposition. That phrase encapsulated his transformation, from cryptographer seeking validation in math to claimant seeking validation in precedent. It also highlighted why the broader crypto movement, founded on verifiable, trustless systems, viewed him as the philosophical opposite of Satoshi Nakamoto. By the time final hearings began in early 2024, years of filings had stacked into thousands of pages. Observers noticed a shift in tone from the bench. Persistent judicial comments questioning the reliability of Wright's evidence, coupled with procedural patience that suggested the court wished for closure more than spectacle. Reporters chronicled moments when Wright sparred with opposing counsel over minutiae, typos, date formats, server names, while avoiding direct answers on cryptographic proofs. The transcripts revealed flashes of brilliance in technical recall, but also evasions when asked simple binary questions like, "Did you sign that file in 2008? For supporters inside the Bitcoin SV ecosystem, none of it mattered. They saw the trial as persecution by corporate interests, protecting an altered Bitcoin. To them, Wright's struggle paralleled Satoshi's original outsider status, misunderstood, besieged, yet ultimately vindicated. Their media outlets framed each procedural delay as evidence of complexity rather than doubt. For detractors, the continued inability to deliver cryptographic proof in any jurisdiction settled the matter more convincingly than any verdict could. As closing arguments loomed, analysts were already calling the Copa proceedings the most comprehensive examination of Wright's claims ever undertaken. Every email, file and signature had been forensically mapped. Experts testified on hash integrity, document lineage and metadata trails. The case's outcome, regardless of specifics, promised to shape how courts interpret digital authorship in decentralized contexts. It wasn't just about Satoshi anymore. It was about whether narrative and legal assertion could override mathematical verification in determining identity. In the quiet moments between hearings, the larger irony couldn't be ignored. Bitcoin had been designed precisely to eliminate the need for trust, to settle truth through code, not courts. Yet here was its alleged creator relying entirely on trust in his story, asking the law to replace the proof he couldn't produce. Whether genius, opportunist, or somewhere in between, Craig Wright had ensured that every institution built on or around Bitcoin had to take a position on his claim. And in doing so, he transformed the question, "Who is Satoshi?" into something bigger. How do we define truth when cryptographic certainty collides with human narrative. By early 2024, almost 10 years after the Wired and Gizmodo leaks, the narrative concluded not in code, but in court. The UK High Court judgment in Copa versus Wright ruled definitively that his documents were falsified. Metadata inconsistencies, mismatched timestamps, and even misused fonts revealed a paper trail of deliberate alteration. Justice Mellor's assessment that Wright lied extensively and repeatedly and filled the courtroom with techno-babble summed up the consensus that had long existed in the crypto world. Officially, the court declared he was not the author of the Bitcoin whitepaper, nor the creator of Bitcoin. For the cryptocurrency community, it was the verdict of evidence over ego. Developers and analysts, from Adam Back to Andreas Antonopoulos, pointed to the same immutable test. Not one of Satoshi's early coins had ever moved under Wright's control. If he were Satoshi, he could prove it in seconds, Antonopoulos remarked. But he never has. That tells you everything. After the ruling, Wright continued insisting the judges misunderstood him and that truth would prevail on appeal. His supporters reframed the defeat as part of a conspiracy to erase the real inventor. Yet among mainstream observers, the illusion had already collapsed. Tax records, court transcripts, and the 2024 judgment all pointed to the same motive traced back to 2013. The attempt to justify fraudulent R&D claims and construct a financial alibi through a legendary identity. The elaborate myth of Satoshi had begun as a tax defense and metastasized into a global performance. The irony is that Wright's efforts, meant to prove genius, fortified the very ideals Satoshi stood for. Bitcoin's design, verification without trust, became the benchmark by which his story failed. Courts could rule, pundits could argue, but no cryptographic signature ever appeared. In a system where code is law, his lawfare couldn't rewrite the code. For the industry, the saga delivered clarity. It exposed how personal ambition can corrupt open systems and how easily myth can blur into legal theatre. It also reminded the crypto world that authenticity isn't declared, it's mathematically demonstrated. Wright's downfall gave the space a useful parable. Even the most determined actor cannot out-argue a blockchain. And so, the mystery survived him. Satoshi Nakamoto remained invisible, untouched by courts or commentary. Craig Wright, the man who tried to wear that anonymity like a crown, left behind a legacy not of creation, but of caution. Proof that in a trustless world, the loudest claimant will always lose to silence.